أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغ مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماه العادون ولا يؤدي حقه المجتهدون الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى تبارك وتعالى والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء وخاتم المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة الدائمة الباقية لأعدائهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: إن الدين عند الله الإسلام. صلوات. I had mentioned last night that inshallah during the 3 nights, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, before we reach to the wiladat of the second Imam, we'll be talking about some of the medical issues. Last night we covered the topic of organ donation, and tonight inshallah we'll continue with the issue of human cloning from the Islamic perspective, and tomorrow night inshallah we'll deal with some of the end-of-life issues that people face, especially when they reach to the old age. As far as the human cloning is concerned, I'm sure everybody has heard this in news in the last few years. And this is actually one of the new areas of research as far as medical science is concerned. And it's created many profound ethical and moral questions for all kinds of societies, whether they are religious, secular, Muslim, non-Muslims. And it is important to understand whether Islam has an opinion on this issue of human cloning or not. Do our mujtahideen in Najaf and Qom, for example, ever sit down and discuss these issues? And that was one perspective I wanted to present tonight, that when we say Islam is actually a religion for all time, it should have the provision and guidelines to deal with all newly occurring situations. In the famous writing of our present Imam, Hujjatul ibn Hassan salawatullah alayhi, he wrote in there that أَمَّا الْحَوَادِثُ الْوَاقِعَةُ, when it comes to the newly occurring situations, refer to our fuqaha, to our mujtahideen and jurists. And this would be one example of that. And what I would like to present to you is just a very brief summary. As I said, I would like to conclude these sessions, other than the major nights, in 15 to 20 minutes. But tonight is a Friday night, so if I go a few minutes beyond that, you'll bear with me. The notes that I have, this actually were written in year 2002 for a conference organized by Imamiyya Medics International. And at that time, we didn't have fatwa of the mujtahideen on this issue. And I'll come to some of the fatwa which are existing now. But it was personally for me very interesting to see that my conclusions in year 2002, were very much in line with the fatwa which are coming now from mujtahideen like Ayatollah Sistani, Ayatollah Nasir Makarim Shirazi, as well as Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Sayyid Al-Hakim from Najaf. When it comes to the issue of human cloning, basically there are two types of process, or two types of cloning which can take place. One is known as reproductive cloning. And we are talking about human beings, not about sheep and animals. And the other is known as the therapeutic cloning. The first one, the reproductive cloning process, is basically the attempt, which has not yet taken place as far as I know, to produce children who are genetically identical to the cell of the donor. So they will be biologically very much like the donor cell. Whereas the therapeutic cloning is a process where they produce embryo for research or for actually producing human parts. This is something making spare parts for the human beings, basically. Put it in a common language. Now, if you look at this both process, when it comes to human reproductive cloning, which means to produce children who are genetically identical to the cell of the donor. Now this, again, we don't want to go into the details. There are two ways that they say. One is that transfer of the nucleus of an adult cell into a enucleated human ovum to create an embryo. And the other is by splitting the embryo. Now we'll just leave these details, scientific and medical details, on the side. Let us go to this issue, this whole idea of reproductive cloning of a human being. What is the Islamic perspective about it? Would Islam allow that or not? And you might be surprised that when we talk about ijtihad, the two main primary source of a mujtahid is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Ma'sumin. Whatever the Prophet and the Imams have said. That becomes the basis of what is halal and what is haram. Now you go to the Quran and you go to the Sunnah of the Ma'sumin, and when you do not find anything against something that you are studying about, then the initial primary assessment of the issue would be that it is not haram. So then we look at the issue of human cloning, reproducing a human being, and who will be, identical to the donor who was provided from where they've got the cell. Now, there is nothing in the Quran which says it is haram. There is nothing there in the Sunnah which says it is haram. So the primary understanding of a mujtahid, the conclusion that a mujtahid would derive, is that it is jaiz. Of course it is very unusual. But because something is unusual, it doesn't make it haram. And actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, in a way, has opened a window of that for us. The normal process of production of a human being is through, father and mother. But we see, of course, in case of Adam, you can say that was the beginning of the process. There was no human being, so Allah created Adam from nothing. But then in between we have one example of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a human being without a father. And so basically the window has already been opened by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. He has created us, He has given us the intelligence, He has given us the resources. So the primary assessment of a mujtahid on this issue would be that it is not haram. Now, that's not the end of the story. This is the primary assessment of the issue. And if you look at this issue, I have a book called Marriage and Morals in Islam, which was published in 1986 in Vancouver. There I have a chapter known as New Techniques in Human Reproduction. And in there, I even talked about a section which says other possibilities in human reproduction discussed by our ulama, where they talk about different kinds of situations which have not even been touched by the science at the moment. Means they just talked about it on a hypothetical level. And so these kinds of issues are not really surprising. They have been discussed about 50 years ago by our mujtahideen, whether if a human is produced without father or without mother or without father and mother. And so the initial study of a mujtahid in these sources will take him to the conclusion that human cloning in itself is not haram. But this is where we have to look at it on a secondary level. Given that it is jaiz, does it mean whatever is jaiz you must do? And this is, where we get all this kind of questions. Maulana, tattoo is haram? And I said, okay, it's not haram. But this bigger question is, why you want to do it? And so the same question comes here. Okay, human cloning, There is no basis in Quran and the Sunnah to say this is haram. But then there is a bigger question. Why? Why do you want to do it? You want to create, super babies who are completely perfect? The day you reach to a level where all human beings are perfect, you will see it's a very boring life. There is no incentive of challenge and this variety in human beings from all different perspectives itself is a beauty. And so when we look at this issue, this question why becomes very important. Maybe people like Hitler will then start looking at the issue of creating human beings only from one race and eliminating the other. Not only that, actually, this will become a psychological nightmare for the cloned person. Just think about a human being cloned. What happens to that person? He has no father, no mother, no grandparents, no brother, no sister, no uncle and aunts, no relatives. You might think it's the best of things, but you don't know. Even if those relatives who bug you all the time, nag you all the time, you think of your life without them and you will see it's not a fun life. All kinds of relatives that we have. That human being, it will really be a nightmare for that person to come to this dunya without any relationship. And this will be a psychological nightmare. And so we also have to look at this ayat in Quran in Surah An-Nisa where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about shaitan, one of the things the shaitan challenged was that He says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, most certainly I will bid them so that they shall alter and change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when I look at all these issues, because this is uncharted waters that we are going into, we don't know what will be the consequences. There can be problems we do not even can envision on a psychological and social level. And that's where then we look at the same issue. Again, you look at second assessment of that. And then the Sharia has a process known as al-hukm al-thanawi. Means you leave the primary assessment, you look at the secondary assessment. And because of all these questions coming in the mind, now a mujtahid will say, okay, we will now use the mechanism of ihtiyat, and we will say, since we do not know anything about this, what is going to happen? And we have a very beautiful way of producing human beings anyway. Allah has, created the system. On a secondary basis, we will be opposed to this process of human cloning. Salawat. Interestingly, when I was looking at the question-answer sections of the websites of Ayatollah Sistani as well as Ayatollah Nasir Makarim Shirazi, their conclusion is exactly the same. They are saying by itself, there is no hurmat in this. Nobody can say this is haram. But by looking at the consequences, which could be very dangerous, this should not be done. Ayatollah Sistani goes to the extent of saying, if a Muslim ruler says this is forbidden, then you have to follow that instruction of not getting involved in this process of human cloning. Salawat. Let us now move on to the second part of the cloning, the therapeutic cloning, where it's not an issue of reproducing a complete human being. Rather, it's a process where they would like to regenerate, human organs or cells or tissues. And this is done again. There's a different process there. The science is itself experimenting and moving forward and finding different ways. Again, on this issue, when a mujtahid is faced with this issue, now in the latest fatwa of our Maraja, I haven't yet seen this different opinion on reproductive cloning versus therapeutic cloning. But looking at this second part of cloning, where it's not an issue of reproducing a human being, rather an organ of a human being or tissues of the human being, In this case, again, we look at the Quran and the Sunnah of the Ma'sumin. There is nothing which says it is haram. So the primary assessment of a mujtahid on this issue would be that therapeutic cloning is not haram. Now, when we look at the benefits of this, especially when we see that this will help the scientist in using the person's master stem cells to replace damaged and diseased parts of the body, then especially we get a list of many things. We're told even brain cells which are damaged by Alzheimer and Parkinson's disease can be replaced. Cornea, muscles and bones of various parts of the body, heart valves, liver cells to repair hepatitis, pancreas for the diabetics, spinal nerves to repair injuries, skin, to treat burn victims, and many benefits which are going to come out of that. When you look at it, then you, even on a secondary level, you will be able to make the judgment as a mujtahid to say not only this is jaiz and permissible, rather from the Islamic point of view, therapeutic cloning would be recommended. Now, there's not a fatwa, but this is my conclusion here. That this will not only be allowed and permissible, this will actually be encouraged in Islam, because then that will take care of this problem of organ donation that we talked yesterday. Because there is a variety of views among mujtahideen, many of them don't agree about on this issue, especially after that. Some allow that. That issue of organ donation will be eliminated if we have this process of replacing the damaged parts of human being by reproducing it through stem cells. And so this will not only be jaiz, rather this will be something encouraged from the Islamic perspective. Salawat alaykum. Finally, when we look at this issue of cloning, the ability of human beings to clone a human being. I remember a few years ago when I was residing the Ashra in New Jersey. There was a moment he used to come and listen to the majlis every night, and then there was niyaz. So one day he sat opposite of me on the sufra, and then he looked at me, he was kept looking, and then he said, Maulana, I wish we had the facility of cloning human beings. I would make 10 clones of you and spread them in North America. Now, well, I took it as a compliment, but this process of, cloning human being, although we are saying we'll be opposed to that because there's no need for it, the big question of why comes up. But this actually makes it very easy for us to understand this phenomenon of resurrection. Because we talk about Qiyamah, and we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to bring us back. He's going to resurrect us. Many people have a question, how will this happen? Even Ibrahim alayhi salam had a question, he believed in Qiyamah, he believed in resurrection, but he wanted his iman and belief to reach on a higher level of yaqeen. Where he says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can you show me how you will, make the dead back into alive? And human cloning basically makes this easy for us to understand the concept of resurrection and Qiyamah. If Allah has created human beings who have the intelligence and the resources and the ability to clone fellow human beings, it is not really a big deal for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to create, recreate or resurrect human beings on the day of Qiyamah for judgment. Salawat alaykum. Finally, human beings will be able to reproduce probably identical bodies. But does that guarantee that you will get identical personalities? Human beings can create khalq, not the khulq. Because the khulq is related to the soul of a human being. Human being can bring about a process of creating the body. Eventually the soul is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. And it is the ruh which actually defines the character and personality of an individual. So you can have, clones like yourself. It doesn't mean that's you. Even if you look at the studies done about identical twins, they are physically, biologically exactly the same, but it doesn't mean their character and their soul and personality are the same. And that's in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On this slide, let me end with the example of somebody who was in a way, quote unquote, a clone of Rasulullah. And that was the young son of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. If you look at his words on the day of Ashura, when Ali Akbar was going, what does he say? He complains to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala against the Yazidi forces, and he says, "Oh Allah, you be witness that today the son of mine who is going, who was very much similar to the Prophet, khalqan wa khulqan wa mantiqan, in appearance, in his character, as well as in the way he spoke. Whenever I had the desire to see my grandfather, I used to see at the face of my son." And so this is very interesting, the shabih of Rasulullah when we talk about Hazrat Ali Akbar alayhi salatu wasalam in Karbala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our amal, increase our tawfiqat, and give us the ability to understand the Quran and the Sunnah of the Masumin in the true way, and be among those who truly love the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.